Love, betrayal, and murder, a deadly combination that has destroyed families for centuries. But what happens when the betrayal comes from within your own home? A husband, a mother-in-law, and a secret that no one saw coming. By the time the truth was exposed, one person was dead, another was behind bars, and a family was shattered beyond repair. This isn't just a scandal. It's a chilling true crime story that will make you question everything about loyalty, trust, and the dark secrets that people keep. James and Emily Carter were the couple everyone admired. Their love story began in high school, a classic tale of young romance that survived the challenges of college careers and the pressures of adulthood. Friends and family saw them as the perfect match. Two people who had grown together, weathered hardships, and built a future hand in hand. Emily was a dedicated schoolteacher, passionate about molding young minds and making a difference in her community. She was warm, intelligent, and deeply loyal to those she loved. James, on the other hand, was an accountant, practical, level-headed, and always focused on securing financial stability for their growing family. The two complemented each other perfectly, or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Their home was the picture of suburban bliss, a charming 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where children played on the sidewalks and neighbors greeted each other with friendly smiles. Inside, the walls were adorned with family photos, their wedding day, vacations, and the birth of their daughter Lily. The Carters had built a life that many envied, but behind the carefully curated image of happiness, cracks were beginning to form. Marriage is never as perfect as it seems from the outside. For James and Emily, the struggles were subtle at first: missed date nights and conversations that revolved around bills and responsibilities rather than love and dreams. But after the birth of their second child, Noah, the tension between them became undeniable. Emily was exhausted. Balancing a demanding job with the responsibilities of being a mother to 2 young children left her little time or energy for anything else. Her days were a blur of diaper changes, lesson plans, and late-night feedings. She loved James, but she was stretched thin, and her patience was wearing down. James, meanwhile, felt neglected. He understood the demands of parenthood, but he couldn't help but feel like he was slowly becoming invisible in his own marriage. Emily was always too tired, too distracted, too busy. Intimacy between them had dwindled, and the emotional connection they once shared had started to erode. He told himself it was just a rough patch, something all couples went through. But as the months passed, the loneliness only grew. Enter Margaret Wilson, Emily's mother. Margaret had always been a strong presence in Emily's life. After her husband passed away nearly a decade ago, she threw herself into supporting her daughter in every way possible. She helped with the children, cooked meals when Emily was overwhelmed, and even took care of the house when Emily needed a break. To James, Margaret was both a blessing and a curse. She was helpful, yes, but she was also overbearing. She had an opinion on everything, from how they should raise their children to how Emily should manage her marriage. Sometimes, James felt like there were 3 people in his relationship instead of 2. But as the distance between James and Emily grew, Margaret's presence began to feel different. She was always there, always listening. When Emily was too busy or too tired, Margaret was the one who paid attention. She was the one who noticed when James was having a bad day, who asked about his work, who offered him words of encouragement. At first, it was innocent, conversations over coffee, venting about life struggles. But soon, the lines between family and something more began to blur. Looking back, James would later say that he never planned for it to happen. No one ever does. But the truth is, emotional affairs often start long before physical ones. And what began as comfort soon turned into temptation. Margaret, despite being in her mid-50s, had aged gracefully. She carried herself with confidence and had a warmth that made people feel safe. And unlike Emily, who was constantly overwhelmed, Margaret had time. Time to listen, time to be present, time to make James feel wanted again. The first real moment of weakness came one night when Margaret stayed late at their house after helping put the kids to bed. Emily had fallen asleep almost immediately, leaving James and Margaret alone in the kitchen, talking over a bottle of wine. The conversation took a turn. James spoke about his loneliness, his frustrations. Margaret listened, nodding, her eyes filled with understanding. And then, in a moment that neither of them could explain, she reached across the table and touched his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it changed everything. From that night forward, the dynamic between them shifted. Their conversations became more intimate. Their glances lingered a little longer. They found excuses to be alone together. And then one evening, when the tension between them had built up to an unbearable level, the unthinkable happened. What should have been an unbreakable bond between family had turned into a dark, forbidden secret. A secret that, once unleashed, could never be undone. Margaret Wilson had always been a woman of strong opinions, a presence that loomed large in any room she entered. She was fiercely protective of her daughter, Emily, and had always made it her mission to ensure her family was taken care of, sometimes, even when it wasn't her place to do so. Widowed at 46, Margaret had spent the last decade alone. She had loved her late husband, but their marriage had been more practical than passionate. After his passing, she didn't seek out new relationships or even consider the idea of romance. Instead, she focused all her energy on her daughter and later her grandchildren. For all her strong-willed tendencies, Margaret had a secret of her own. She was lonely. As much as she loved being a grandmother, it wasn't the same as having companionship. She had spent years convincing herself that she didn't need a man in her life, that she was content with the role of mother and caretaker. But deep down, there was an emptiness, a longing for affection, for attention, for something more. She never imagined that the man who would fulfill that need would be her own son-in-law. At first, Margaret didn't think much of James's growing frustration with Emily. She understood the struggles of marriage. She had lived through them herself. But the more she watched, the more she sympathized with him. Emily was always exhausted, always distant. Margaret saw the way James looked at his wife, desperate for affection, for acknowledgement, and she felt sorry for him. She understood what it was like to feel invisible in a marriage, to crave intimacy and connection. What started as innocent conversations between them soon became something deeper. They spent more time alone, finding comfort in each other's company. Margaret told herself it was harmless, that she was just offering support to a struggling husband. But the human heart is complicated. Lines that should have been unbreakable began to blur. Margaret had always prided herself on being a moral woman. She had raised Emily to have strong values, to build a stable home, and to be loyal to her family. But when it came to her own desires, she found herself making excuses. She told herself that Emily had pushed James away, that she, Margaret, was simply filling a void. That age didn't matter. Love didn't follow rules. And then, one night, everything changed. James and Margaret had been drinking wine together after putting the children to bed. Emily had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted from another long day. Alone in the dimly lit living room, James opened up in a way he never had before. He spoke about how he felt trapped in his own marriage, how he and Emily had grown apart. He admitted that he had thought about leaving, but the children kept him there. And then he said something that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. "You're the only one who really understands me." Margaret should have stopped it right there. She should have reminded him that she was his mother-in-law, and that this was wrong. But she didn't, because for the first time in years, someone was looking at her like she mattered, like she was beautiful, like she was wanted. And in that moment, she made a choice that would destroy everything. At first, Margaret and James convinced themselves that what they had wasn't hurting anyone. They were careful and cautious, ensuring that no one would suspect a thing. But secrecy has a way of unraveling, and their affair quickly became harder to hide. James became more distant from Emily, avoiding intimacy altogether. Margaret, who had always been protective of her daughter, now found herself lying to her. making excuses for James's behavior, covering for their stolen moments together. Guilt gnawed at her, but the passion between them was too strong. And then the impossible happened. Margaret was pregnant. At 56, Margaret had assumed she was too old to conceive. She had long ago accepted that her days of pregnancy were over. When she first started feeling fatigued, she attributed it to stress. When nausea set in, she blamed her diet. And when she missed her period, she told herself it was menopause. But something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She bought a pregnancy test on a whim, half mocking herself for even considering the possibility. But the moment she saw the result, her world tilted on its axis. Positive, it didn't seem real. She took another test, and another. Each one confirmed the impossible. Margaret stood in her bathroom, staring at the test with wide eyes, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. She was pregnant, with her daughter's husband's child. Telling James was the hardest thing she had ever done. When she finally worked up the nerve, he reacted exactly as she feared he would. "No," he said immediately, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible." Margaret simply held out the test. James stared at it, his face draining of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if struggling to form a coherent thought. "This can't be happening," he muttered. Margaret felt a sickening combination of emotions, fear, shame, and, beneath it all, a flicker of something dangerous. Hope. Because as much as she knew this was wrong, she had also never felt more needed. She was carrying his child. This was undeniable proof that their connection was real, that what they had wasn't just some sordid affair. But James didn't see it that way. "This ruins everything," he whispered, pacing the room like a caged animal. "What are we supposed to do?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm keeping it." James froze. No, you can't." "Margaret, think about what this means." "Emily," Margaret cut him off. "I am thinking, and I can't get rid of it." James ran his hands through his hair, frustration radiating off him in waves. "You don't understand," he hissed. "If she finds out..." "She will find out," Margaret snapped. "Eventually. The truth always comes out." James looked at her then, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something close to fear in his eyes. The days that followed were filled with tension and whispered arguments. James begged Margaret to terminate the pregnancy. He told her they could move past this, that they could pretend it had never happened. But Margaret refused. Something inside her had shifted. She had spent years feeling invisible, just a mother, just a grandmother, just someone who existed in the background of other people's lives. But now, she had something of her own, a child, a future. She told herself that James would come around. Once he sees the ultrasound and accepts that this is real, he will want the baby too. But James saw it as a ticking time bomb. He knew Emily would never forgive him, that this would destroy everything. And so, without Margaret's knowledge, he began making plans to ensure that Emily never found out. Despite their efforts to keep the pregnancy a secret, Margaret and James underestimated one thing: Emily's intuition. She had been noticing changes in her mother. Margaret was nauseous, tired, and acting strangely. At first, Emily assumed it was health-related, maybe the onset of menopause. But then she found something she wasn't supposed to see. A crumpled-up doctor's appointment slips in Margaret's purse. A prenatal visit. Confused, Emily confronted her mother. "Are you pregnant?" she asked, half laughing at the absurdity of the question. Margaret hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Emily's stomach dropped. "Mom, who's the father?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. And in that silence, Emily knew. The walls of her world came crashing down. "Tell me it's not him," she pleaded. "Tell me it's not James." But Margaret's silence was the only confirmation she needed. Emily felt the room spin. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the walls of her world were closing in on her. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something far worse. Her husband, the father of her children, and her own mother, the woman who had raised her, who was supposed to protect her, had done the unthinkable. Emily's hands trembled as rage, heartbreak, and disbelief crashed over her like a tidal wave. "How long?" she demanded. Margaret flinched. "Emily, please." "How long?" A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. "Almost a year." Emily let out a broken laugh, a sound of pure disbelief and agony. "A year," she repeated. "A year of lying to me. A year of sneaking around behind my back. A year of—" Her voice cracked, and she covered her mouth, trying to stop the sob that threatened to escape. James, the man she had loved since high school, the man she had built a life with, had been sleeping with her mother for a year. And now they are having a child together. The betrayal was so deep, so incomprehensible, that Emily could barely process it. Her mind raced, replaying every interaction from the past year, searching for the signs she had missed. The late nights, the whispered conversations, the way James had stopped touching her, stopped looking at her the way he used to. How could she have been so blind? Emily stormed out of her mother's house, her pulse pounding as she drove home in a daze. James was in the kitchen when she arrived, casually scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. Emily stood in the doorway, gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" she said, her voice eerily calm. James looked up, and in an instant she saw it. The flicker of guilt, of realization. He knew. He didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Emily, Don't," she snapped. "Don't you dare try to explain this away." James's jaw clenched. "I never meant for it to happen." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, you just tripped and fell into my mother's bed? That's rich." James rubbed his face, frustration creeping into his features. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" she demanded. "Was it love? Was it just sex? Or were you trying to destroy our family?" James exhaled sharply. "It just happened. I was lonely. You were always busy. And Margaret—" Emily cut him off with a sharp glare. "Margaret is my mother." The weight of that truth settled between them, like a bomb waiting to explode. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then James made a mistake. He stepped forward, reaching for her. Please, let's talk about this." Something inside her snapped, and everything went silent. Emily Carter had never considered herself an impulsive person. She prided herself on being level-headed and rational, the type of woman who thought things through before acting. But in that moment, standing in her kitchen, staring at the man who had shattered her entire world, she felt something she had never experienced before. Pure, blinding rage. The betrayal wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just a husband cheating on his wife. It was deeper, more insidious. Her husband had broken his vows, yes, but her mother had violated something even more sacred. A mother is supposed to protect her daughter, to stand by her side, to guide her, to be her safe place. Instead, Margaret had stolen from her. She had taken what wasn't hers, ripped apart the family Emily had worked so hard to build, and in the end, she had done it all without remorse. The weight of it pressed down on Emily, suffocating her, consuming her until there was nothing left but raw, seething fury. And then James made the mistake of speaking. "Emily, listen to me." "Listen to you?" she interrupted, her voice dangerously low. "You want me to listen?" James took a cautious step forward, hands raised in a pathetic attempt to calm her. "I never meant for it to happen," he said, as if that changed anything. Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You never meant for it to happen?" she echoed, her voice rising. "Oh, that makes it better. You just accidentally tripped and landed in bed with my mother." James exhaled, frustration creeping into his features. "I was lonely, Emily. You were always tired, always busy with the kids and with work. And Margaret, Emily's entire body tensed. Don't say her name. But James didn't listen. Margaret was there for me. She understood me in a way you didn't anymore. The words hit her harder than a slap to the face. Emily clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms so hard they nearly broke the skin. The nerve, the absolute audacity of this man, to stand in front of her and try to justify what he had done. He had ruined their marriage, their home, their future. He had taken the life they had built together and set it on fire. And now he wanted her to understand? James must have realized he was making things worse because he took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. I'm sorry, he said, his voice softer now, placating. But we can work through this. Emily went completely still. Work through this? She repeated, almost as if testing the words. James swallowed. I know it's going to take time, but... He didn't get to finish his sentence. Emily's vision blurred with rage as she lunged toward the kitchen drawer, yanking it open so hard it nearly came off its track. James flinched as soon as he saw what she grabbed. The gun. They had bought it years ago for protection, a precaution after a break-in happened in their neighborhood. It had sat in that drawer for years and used. Until now. James's eyes widened in shock. Emily, put it down. But Emily barely heard him over the pounding in her ears. You had an affair with my mother, she seethed, her grip tightening on the weapon. And now she's pregnant. James took another step back, hands raised. I know you're angry. Angry, she snapped. No, James. I was angry 10 minutes ago. This is something else entirely. Her hands shook, but whether from rage or devastation, she couldn't tell. James's face was pale now, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Emily, please. Think about the kids. The mention of their children sent another surge of fury through her. Their children, Lily and Noah, would grow up knowing that their father had betrayed their mother in the worst possible way, that their grandmother had taken part in it. Would they even be able to understand what had happened when they were older? Would they ever forgive him? Emily wasn't sure she could. What happened next was something Emily would later struggle to remember with clarity. She wasn't sure if she pulled the trigger intentionally or if it was the result of shaking hands, of adrenaline and fury mixing together into a deadly combination. But the moment the gun fired, everything in the room shifted. James staggered backward, a look of utter disbelief crossing his face before he collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Emily stood there, frozen, staring at him as a dark red stain spread across his shirt. The gun slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. And then, in the dead silence that followed, Emily did the only thing she could think of. She reached for the phone and dialed 911. Her voice was eerily calm when the operator answered. My husband is dead, she said. I shot him. When the police arrived at the Carter home, they found Emily standing in the kitchen, her hands covered in blood. The gun lay discarded on the floor beside her. She did not attempt to flee, no effort to explain. She simply stood there, staring at the lifeless body of her husband as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The officers moved quickly, securing the scene and checking for any signs of life in James. But it was too late. The single gunshot wound to his chest had been fatal. He had bled out in minutes. Emily was arrested without resistance. As they placed the cuffs around her wrists, she remained eerily calm, her expression blank. The only words she spoke were to ask about her children. What's going to happen to Lily and Noah? News of the crime spread like wildfire. A wife shooting her husband was already a headline-worthy case. But when the details of the affair emerged, the public was left stunned. A husband having an affair with his mother-in-law, a pregnancy that exposed a secret, and a wife who, upon learning the truth, snapped in a moment of unimaginable betrayal. The media descended upon the trial like vultures. Every news outlet, every talk show, every internet forum dissected the case, debating whether Emily was a cold-blooded murderer or a broken woman who had been pushed too far. Emily's defense attorney painted her as a victim of emotional and psychological torment. They argued that the discovery of the affair had sent her into a state of temporary insanity, that the betrayal had been too much for any person to bear. The prosecution, however, saw things differently. They acknowledged the betrayal, but maintained that Emily had made a conscious decision to grab the gun and pull the trigger. This wasn't a crime of self-defense. It was revenge. The jury was divided. Some saw a devastated wife who had lost control in a moment of unbearable grief. Others saw a calculated killer who had chosen murder over divorce. In the end, Emily was convicted of voluntary manslaughter instead of murder. The jury believed she had acted in the heat of passion, not with premeditation. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While Emily faced justice, Margaret disappeared from public life. She had been questioned by police but was not charged with any crime. Though morally reprehensible, an affair, even one as shocking as this, was not illegal. But the public vilified her nonetheless. People called her a homewrecker, a monster, a disgrace to motherhood. She lost her job, was shunned by her community, and eventually moved out of state, changing her name to escape the scrutiny. And then there was the baby. Margaret gave birth to a baby boy, a child who carried a legacy of scandal and destruction before he even took his first breath. But she never got the chance to raise him. The child was placed into the foster care system. His biological mother was deemed unfit to care for him due to the circumstances surrounding his conception. No one knows where Margaret went after that. Some say she still visits the grave of her dead lover in secret. Others believe she lives in solitude, haunted by the choices that destroyed her family. Lily and Noah, too young to understand the full gravity of what had happened, were placed in the care of Emily's sister. They grew up knowing only pieces of the truth. One day, they would learn everything. One day, they would have to reconcile the fact that their mother killed their father, that their grandmother had been the other woman, that their entire family had been torn apart by a forbidden love affair that should have never happened. This case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how love, betrayal, and rage can intertwine in the most destructive ways. James and Margaret thought they could keep their secret hidden. They convinced themselves that their affair wasn't hurting anyone. But secrets always have a way of coming to light. And when they do, the consequences can be deadly. Was Emily a villain? Or was she a victim of unbearable betrayal? Was Margaret a lonely woman who lost her way? Or was she the true architect of destruction? And what about James? Was he a selfish man who got what he deserved? Or was he simply a fool who made the worst mistake of his life? There are no easy answers. Only the wreckage of a family that was torn apart by a love that should have never existed.